Karim scoffed at the old wives' tales. Jinns in the desert? Nonsense. He prided himself on logic, on reason. The desert held no fear for him, only the harsh beauty of nature's extremes. He'd driven these roads countless times, his supply truck a lifeline to the scattered villages. Folklore was for the gullible, a crutch for the fearful. Karim had no need for such things. He had his wits, his truck, and the scorching sun above. The stories he'd heard as a child, whispers of creatures made of smoke and shadow, held no power over him. They were just stories, meant to keep children close to the campfire and away from the dark. He was a grown man, a provider, a pragmatist. The desert was his office, and he knew every dune and wadi like the back of his hand, or so he thought. The village of Alif Bay clung to the edge of the desert like a withered hand grasping for purchase. It was a place forgotten by time, where the only sounds were the wind whistling through crumbling buildings and the occasional braying of a donkey. Karim had finished his deliveries. Dates, flour, bottled water, the essentials of life in this unforgiving land. The villagers, their faces etched with the hardship of generations, treated him with a wary respect. They knew he was their only link to the world beyond the dunes. He was their lifeline, their connection to civilization. But their eyes, he noticed, sometimes held a flicker of something else. Fear, superstition. He dismissed it, attributing it to their isolation. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple as Karim began his journey back. His ancient truck, held together by duct tape and prayers, coughed and sputtered. He swore under his breath, "Not now, not out here." The engine gave a final shuddering groan and died. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. He tried the ignition again, but the only response was the click of a dying battery. Damn, he was stranded. He checked his supplies, a dented canteen with a few mouthfuls of water, some dates, and a tattered prayer rug his grandmother had forced on him as a joke. The joke didn't seem so funny now. He was alone. The desert air, which had been stiflingly hot just moments before, turned abruptly cold. A shiver ran down Karim's spine. It was the quick desert chill, he told himself, nothing more. He started walking, heading for the faint lights of a village he remembered in the distance. The silence was broken only by the crunch of his own footsteps on the sand. Then he heard it, a whisper, faint and indistinct, carried on the wind. He stopped, straining to listen. It came again, a rustling sound like dry leaves skittering across the dunes. But there were no leaves here, only the endless expanse of sand. His heart began to pound in his chest. He was being watched. Section 5. The shadow takes form. The moon, full and fat, cast long, eerie shadows across the dunes, and then he saw it. A shape, darker than the surrounding darkness, coalescing in the distance. It writhed and twisted, growing larger with each passing moment. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced him. This was no trick of the light, no figment of his imagination. This was real. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him, taunting him. He recognized the language now, the ancient tongue of the jinns, the language of nightmares. His skepticism crumbled like sand in his hands. He was facing something ancient, something powerful, and it terrified him to his core. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but then a memory surfaced. His grandmother, her voice raspy with age, reciting verses from the Quran. For protection, she'd said, her eyes twinkling with ancient wisdom. He'd scoffed then, but now he clung to those words like a lifeline. He fumbled for the prayer rug, his fingers clumsy with fear. He spread it on the sand, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He began to recite, his voice trembling at first, then growing in strength. The words, imbued with generations of faith, filled the night. A surge of power, unexpected and exhilarating, coursed through him. He wasn't sure if he believed, but he clung to the words, his only weapon against the encroaching darkness. The shadow hesitated, its edges flickering as if consumed by an unseen fire. The whispers, once menacing, became confused, tinged with fear. The entity recoiled from the sound of his voice. From the ancient protection, it writhed, a tide of darkness trying to resist the pull of the light. Then, with a sound like a sigh, it began to dissipate. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, the shadow retreated, dissolving back into the night from which it had come. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart. He remained on the prayer rug, his body trembling with exhaustion and the receding tide of adrenaline. The desert was silent once more. The eastern sky began to lighten, painting the sand dunes in hues of rose and gold. The first rays of the sun, his savior, warmed his face. He rose to his feet, his joints stiff and aching. He looked around at the familiar landscape, but it was different now. It held a new kind of beauty, a terrible majesty that he had never acknowledged before. He walked back towards his truck, each step filled with purpose. He would call for help when he reached the village. He would fix his truck. He would continue his life, but something had shifted within him. He had looked into the face of his deepest fears and had found the strength to resist. He never spoke of that night, not even to himself, but the memory remained, seared onto his soul. He continued to drive his routes, bringing supplies to the isolated villages scattered across the desert. He no longer scoffed at the old tales, the whispers of jinns and other desert spirits. He knew now that the desert held secrets, ancient and powerful, and he knew that he was forever bound to this land, both its beauty and its terror. He was a changed man, forever marked by the shadow in the desert. He no longer feared the darkness, for he had seen the light that dwelled within it. He drove on, a silent guardian, against the unseen, his heart a compass, pointing him towards the ever-shifting horizon.